into a maze of snipers and booby traps, every window a potential death sentence, every door a gamble with odds that seemed to get worse by the hour. By noon, they were down to 14 men and running low on ammunition. That's when they'd heard the crying. The sound had been coming from a small building near the village center, a structure that intelligence had flagged as a potential weapons cache. Frank had approached with Williams and Rodriguez, expecting to find enemy combatants using civilian cover. Instead, they'd found 12 children huddled in a storage room, ages 5 to maybe 13, left behind when the adults fled or died in the crossfire. The youngest couldn't have been older than Mai, and when she looked up at Frank with terror-bright eyes, he'd felt something break inside his chest. "We can't leave them," he'd told Williams, who was already shaking his head. "Sarge, we got orders. This whole village is compromised. Artillery's been called in." Frank had looked at the children again, seeing his niece's face in every expression of fear, hearing his mother's voice in their soft whimpers. "Then we take them with us." What followed was the longest 6 hours of his life, moving through hostile territory with 12 children who didn't speak English, trying to keep them quiet and calm while enemy fire erupted around them. Rodriguez took a sniper's bullet through the throat in the 3rd hour. Williams stepped on a mine in the 5th, losing his left leg below the knee. Frank had carried the smallest girl, the one who reminded him of Mai, on his back while the others followed in a ragged line. Every 100 yards felt like a mile. Every shadow could hide death. Every sound could mean the end of all of them. They'd made it to within half a click of the extraction zone when the mortar rounds started falling. The first one hit 50 meters to their left, showering them with dirt and shrapnel. The second one landed directly in their path, cutting off their route to safety. "This way," Frank had shouted, leading them toward a bomb crater that might provide cover. But as they ran, he'd heard the whistle of another incoming round, and he'd known with terrible certainty where it was going to land. The choice he made in that moment would replay in his dreams for the next 54 years. He'd pushed the children toward the crater, throwing himself over as many as he could reach, feeling the explosion lift him off the ground and slam him back down again. When the ringing in his ears stopped and the smoke cleared, 7 of the children were still alive. 5 were not. The little girl he'd been carrying, the one with Mai's smile, lay crumpled beneath a piece of twisted metal, her wooden elephant crushed beside her small hand. Frank had gathered the survivors and completed the mission, getting them to the extraction zone where medics and chaplains waited. He'd written the report, received a Bronze Star for heroism, and never spoken about that day again. The official record showed that Sergeant Frank Carruthers had successfully led a rescue operation that saved 7 civilian lives under extreme combat conditions. What it didn't show was the weight of the 5 he couldn't save, the sound of that little girl's last breath, the way her elephant had looked broken on the jungle floor. He'd carried those 5 ghosts with him through the rest of his tour, through his return home to protests and contempt, through decades of trying to forget what couldn't be forgotten. When people called him a baby killer, they had no idea how close to the truth they were. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd failed to do. Now, holding Mai's elephant in his storage unit while the internet mocked his pain, Frank understood that some wounds never heal. The children at Jefferson Elementary would go home tonight to their safe beds and their Netflix accounts, never knowing that the old man they'd watched being humiliated had once thrown his body between innocent children and incoming artillery. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. He'd been rejected for not being hero enough by people who would never understand that real heroism wasn't about winning. It was about the weight you carried when you failed. His phone buzzed with another notification. Someone had created a meme using his face, captioning it with, "When you show up to the wrong war but still want participation trophies." Below it, hundreds of laughing emojis and comments about snowflake veterans who couldn't handle reality. Frank set the elephant carefully on a storage box and reached for a pen and paper. If the world wanted to know who he really was, maybe it was time to tell them. Not about his medals or his service record, but about a little girl named Mai and the choice he'd made in a crater 54 years ago. He began to write, his handwriting, shaky but determined. To the children of Jefferson Elementary and their parents, you were right to send me away today. I am not the hero you wanted. I am not the hero anyone wanted. But I am the hero 5 children needed on April 8, 1969, and I failed them. The letter took him 3 hours to write, and when he finished, he sealed it in an envelope addressed to Principal Martinez. Whether she would read it to the children or share it with the parents who had cast him out, he didn't know. But the truth deserved to be told, even if, especially if, it changed nothing. The next morning, Frank put on his dress uniform one last time and drove to Jefferson Elementary. The parking lot was empty except for a few staff cars and a maintenance truck. He left the letter in the main office's mailbox and walked back to his car, feeling lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for decades had finally shifted. The video of his humiliation continued to spread, the comments growing more vicious by the hour. But in his apartment that night, Frank placed Mai's elephant on his nightstand and slept more peacefully than he had in years. 3 days later, Principal Martinez called. Her voice was different this time, softer, weighted with something that might have been understanding. "Mr. Carruthers," she said, "I read your letter. I had no idea. The school board would like to invite you back. We want to do this right." Frank looked at the elephant on his nightstand, thinking of 5 children whose names he'd memorized but never spoken aloud, whose faces he'd carried in silence for more than half a century. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But some stories aren't meant for children." He hung up the phone and returned to his silence, where the dead children waited patiently for him to join them, where heroism and failure blended into something that had no name, where the weight of memory was both burden and blessing. The internet forgot about him within a week, moving on to newer outrages and fresher targets. But Frank carried on, as he always had, bearing witness to moments that existed beyond judgment, beyond politics, beyond the simple moral categories that allowed people to sleep peacefully in their beds. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. The smartphone screen cracked against the concrete as Frank Carruthers hurled it with all the force his 73-year-old arm could muster, watching it shatter into a spider web of broken glass that reflected his weathered face in 1,000 fractured pieces. "Fake hero," the teenager's voice echoed in his head, the same words that had been flooding his phone for the past 6 hours since the video went viral. "Vietnam wasn't even a real war. My great-grandfather fought Nazis. This old man's just playing dress-up." Frank stared at his hands, still trembling, still steady enough to thread a needle or field strip an M16, still capable of violence when necessary. The olive-green dress uniform hung loose on his diminished frame, the ribbons and medals catching, the harsh fluorescent light of the storage unit where he'd retreated after fleeing the chaos at Jefferson Elementary. The morning had started with such promise. Principal Martinez had called personally, her voice warm with manufactured enthusiasm. "Mr. Carruthers, we'd be honored to have you speak at our Memorial Day assembly. The children need to hear from real heroes." Real heroes. The phrase had made his stomach clench even then, but he'd pressed his uniform anyway, polished the brass until it gleamed, practiced his 5-minute speech about service and sacrifice. He'd even allowed himself a moment of pride as he'd looked in the mirror. Frank Carruthers, Sergeant First Class, 1st Cavalry Division, still standing. The first sign of trouble came when he'd approached the school's main entrance. A cluster of parents stood near the flagpole, their voices carrying across the morning air. "I don't understand why they invited him," a woman in yoga pants was saying to her friend. "My father-in-law was in World War II. He liberated concentration camps. That was a real war. Vietnam was just, what was it even for?" Frank had kept walking, jaw set, telling himself their ignorance didn't matter. He was here for the children. But inside the gymnasium, as he sat on the small metal chair beside the podium, watching 300 elementary school students file in with their chatter and shuffle, the whispers had grown louder. Parents pulled out phones, snapping photos and recording videos before he'd even stood to speak. Principal Martinez had introduced him with careful, politically correct language that somehow managed to thank him for his service while simultaneously apologizing for it. "Mr. Carruthers served our country during a very difficult time in our nation's history, and we appreciate his willingness to share his experiences with us today." He'd approached the microphone, looked out at the sea of young faces, and begun the speech he'd rehearsed. But 30 seconds in, a parent's voice had cut through the gymnasium like a blade. "Excuse me?" A man in his 40s, arms crossed, designer stubble framing his jaw. "I think there's been some confusion. This is Memorial Day. We're supposed to be honoring heroes who died for freedom, Vietnam veterans." He'd paused, letting the silence stretch. "Well, that conflict ended in defeat, didn't it? And the reports about what some soldiers did over there." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was like a physical blow. Frank had gripped the podium, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that meant the memories were clawing their way to the surface. Another parent had stood. "My children don't need to hear war stories that might traumatize them, especially from a war that most historians agree was unjustified." "Wait." A woman near the back had raised her phone higher, making sure she was getting everything. "Isn't this the same guy who was arrested for that protest thing downtown? The one who got into it with those college kids?" Frank's throat had gone dry. The protest, 3 months ago, when he'd lost his temper at a group of students burning an American flag outside the courthouse. He hadn't touched anyone, had only shouted, but the video of his red face and raised voice had made him look like exactly what these people expected. An unhinged veteran, a relic of a shameful war. "I think it would be better if Mr. Carruthers left," the first parent had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This isn't appropriate for children." The principal had looked stricken, caught between her invitation and the growing hostility of her constituents. "Perhaps we could—" "He should go." More voices now, a chorus of polite but firm rejection. This isn't what Memorial Day is about. Frank had left without a word, walking through the parting crowd like Moses in reverse, the Red Sea of suburban disapproval closing behind him. Someone had followed him to the parking lot with a phone, capturing his retreat, his fumbling with car keys, the way his hands shook as he tried to start the engine. Now, 6 hours later, the video had 18 million views and climbing. The comments section was a cesspool of mockery and political bile. "Boomer snowflake can't handle rejection. Vietnam vets are just glorified baby killers anyway. This is what white male privilege looks like when it gets challenged." Frank pulled his laptop from the storage unit's back corner, where he kept the things he couldn't bear to have in his apartment but couldn't bring himself to throw away. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, logging into social media accounts he rarely used, watching his humiliation spread across the internet like a virus. The worst part wasn't the mockery. He'd endured worse. It was the certainty in their voices, the casual dismissal of everything he'd tried to do, everything he'd failed to do. They spoke about Vietnam like it was ancient history, like the choices made there existed in a moral vacuum separate from their comfortable lives. A new notification popped up. Someone had found his old address, posted it along with a photo of his apartment building. "This is where the fake hero lives. Maybe we should pay him a visit and explain why his service wasn't real service." Frank closed the laptop and reached for the metal box buried beneath a stack of moldy photo albums. His fingers remembered the combination even after all these years. 04-08-69. The date, everything changed. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, lay a small wooden elephant, crudely carved, painted in bright primary colors that had faded but never disappeared entirely. He held it in his palm, feeling its familiar weight. And for the first time in 6 hours, the rage gave way to something deeper and infinitely more painful. The elephant had belonged to a little girl named Mai. She couldn't have been more than 7, with enormous dark eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the jungle. Frank had first seen her in the village outside Firebase Charlie, selling handmade trinkets to soldiers who had money and conscience enough to buy them. He'd purchased the elephant not because he wanted it, but because her parents looked thin and desperate, and because something about her reminded him of his niece back home in Ohio. She'd wrapped it carefully in a piece of newspaper, bowing formally as she handed it over, and he'd tucked it into his chest pocket, feeling foolish but somehow lighter. That was 3 weeks before the morning when the radio crackled to life with coordinates and a mission that would haunt him until the day he died. April 8, 1969. Intelligence had reported a North Vietnamese supply cache hidden in a village 12 clicks southeast of their position. Simple recon mission, in and out. Minimal engagement expected. What they'd found instead was a Viet Cong stronghold and a firefight that lasted 18 hours. Frank had been leading second squad when the first RPG hit their transport, killing their lieutenant instantly and leaving Frank in charge of 19 terrified kids who'd been in country for an average of 4 months. The village they were supposed to scout had turned.